Good morning. I'm Rollie Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And this morning, we're going to be having a very interesting discussion about the FPRI's just published volume, Russia's Way of War in Syria. And we are fortunate this morning to have with us the three co-editors of that volume. Aaron Stein, who is our Director of Research and Director of our Middle East program and our Acting Director of our National Security program. Chris Miller, who's the Director of our Eurasia program, and Robert Hamilton, who is a Senior Fellow and a Professor at the Army War College. This is I'm told, only the second book on this topic. We have a competitor think tank that published one, but I'm told informally that ours is better. It's a fascinating topic. If you had fallen asleep 10 years ago and awakened today, well, there are a lot of things that would have surprised you, but what's gone on in Syria would definitely be among them. Since the Cold War, it's Russia's first military engagement outside of the borders of the former Soviet Union. In addition to, of course, the active warfare that has gone on, it, of course, created a huge, significant humanitarian and refugee crisis that had implications well beyond its own borders, both politically and economically. So I think it's an important topic for FPRI and for our country and our international listeners to understand. I'm going to be turning this over shortly to Bob Hamilton, Chris Miller, and Aaron Stein. But before I do, I want to thank our supporters and donors, and also the very generous support of the SCAFE Foundation, without which we would not be able to produce this book or do a lot of the work we do in our Eurasia program. As we go along, please put your questions in the Q&A box. If you click at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little box that says Q&A. You can put your questions in there. In the chat window, we'll also be we'll be putting a link to the book itself, which is available for free to all of you on the FPRI website. So I encourage you to get a copy of that, download a copy of that book. And without further ado, let me go ahead and turn it over to Aaron and Chris, and I think Bob too, to talk about the origins of this volume.
Well, thanks, Rollie, and thanks for the introduction, and thank you, everybody, for joining. I'm just going to echo Rollie in saying that if you do have questions, please put it in the chat box. I'm here just to give a little background about the origins of this edited volume, which really was a collaborative process between, Bob, as we know him, Robert, Chris, and Maia. All three here are on the call. And it's looking at a topic that I thought, and I think we all three thought, was of particular importance as the United States itself and its Western allies began to reorient and rethink the way it thinks about national security and grand strategy, which is that these sort of small wars of the past, those wars being typified by the interventions, counterterrorism type interventions, should no longer drive American thinking about how it uses force, or at least how it plans to use force, and that it should begin to plan for, as the sort of buzzword of the day is, as of great power competition. And I thought, based upon extensive conversations for an own side project I'm working on, is that the conflict in Syria provides a good understanding of how one of those great powers actually conducts itself in conflict. And I believe, I can't remember, and there probably is other instances, but this is definitely a unique time in history where you have American and Russian forces co-located. At times, the relationship is fraught and with tension, but most of the times it is let's say, professional, if professionally antagonistic, I think would be the way I would describe it. And the lessons that we could derive and learn from watching the Russians operate up close. And in reality, the lessons that they can derive and learn from them watching us up close. So it is sort of a blueprint, if you will, for updating assumptions about how great competition could play out. And so that is the origins of the book. And then it really took on a life of its own as the three of us, and I'll turn it over to Chris right now, began to think about how to interject not just the American understanding about how we think the Russians are operating, because I think that there is a gambit or a range of understandings about how that happens, but also Russians themselves, to hear from them about their own operations, how they contextualize it, and how they think about it, and how that again should inform thinking about how a great power uses force beyond its borders. So with that, I'll stop, and I will turn it over to Chris before we give the floor to Bob.
Great. Well, thanks, Aaron, for that introduction. I thought what I could do is just highlight a couple of the chapters that are in the book as a way to encourage you to download and to read all of it. And just say at the outset that one of the things that I think made this project really take off was that Aaron, Bob, and I were able to engage a series of real experts on the topics at hand and draw on their expertise in putting together a broader story about how Russia waged war in Syria and the lessons that the Russian leadership have drawn. The book begins with an introduction from myself, Bob, and Aaron about how the war began and how Russia got itself involved. As we approach the 5th anniversary of Russia's involvement, it's worth remembering that for the first couple of years of the war, Russia wasn't really a major player. It was only halfway through the conflict that the Russian military began to involve itself in a significant way. Chapter 2 by Anna Borshchevskaya of the Washington Institute examines the geopolitical logic behind Russia's intervention and also compares Russia's way of war in Syria with previous Russian conflicts, including the war in Ukraine and Georgia, and also conflicts in the North Caucasus over the past couple of decades, and finds many continuities as well as differences between the war in Syria and these other conflicts. The 3rd chapter, authored by Michael Kofman, examines Russia's road to war in Syria and explores how the different parts of Russia's military work together to achieve Russia's military aims, combining both the analysis at the strategic level with also a very detailed look at tactics deployed in Syria. Chapter 4, co-authored by Lester Grau and Charles Bartles of the Foreign Military Studies Office, examine Russian ground forces in Syria. Although the Russian government has primarily focused on its air and naval assets in Syria, there is also a substantial contingent of ground forces as well, which is often picked up less in media accounts, but in fact has played a really important role at some key points in the conflict. The 5th chapter is authored by Anton Lavrov, a Russia-based military observer for Izvestia newspaper, a Russian newspaper, who examines Russian aerospace forces in the conflict and argues that they've really outperformed expectations and learned a substantial amount about conducting air operations over the course of the war, something that they weren't able to do in previous conflicts such as Ukraine, where Russian air assets played a much more limited role just given the scope of the conflict. And so in some ways, Syria proved an excellent testing ground for Russian aerospace forces. The 6th chapter is authored by Igor Delanoe, the deputy head of the French-Russian Analytical Center Observo. He's based in Moscow and is an expert on Russian naval forces. And in his chapter, Igor shows not only the role that Russian naval forces played in the conflict in Syria, but also how this served as a foothold for expanding Russia's influence in the Eastern Mediterranean more generally. And I think one of the really fascinating parts of the conflict in Syria is the extent to which, even though there's a certain extent which the war itself in Syria is has declined in its in the amount of fighting that's happening today compared to several years ago, the war itself has actually expanded in many ways. And in some ways, it's hard to understand the conflict in Libya right now without understanding how Russia used its intervention in Syria as a springboard into Libya too. And so Igor sets the Syrian war into the broader Eastern Mediterranean context, I think, in a way that few other observers have done. And the final chapter is a conclusion written by Bob Hamilton. And so rather than try to summarize Bob's points for him, I'll turn it over to Maia and Bob for a discussion on the lessons that Bob has drawn from Russia's war in Syria. So with that, Maia and Bob, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Chris. Let me congratulate each of you on this really excellent project. It was a pleasure for us at FPRI to work on. I want to thank our colleagues at FPRI, especially Natalia Kopitnik and Tom Shattuck, for helping us put this volume together rather quickly, because it was very important for us that we got this book out in time for the 5th year anniversary of Russia's intervention in Syria, which is this month. So I want to sort of have a little discussion with Bob about the book, about the anniversary, about some of the key findings in the book. But I want to encourage our audience members to send in their questions. We won't speak for too long, and we'll turn to your questions as soon as they come in. I also want to remind you that we just shared the link to the book in the chat box. The book is available on our website for free download, and it's in addition to it being a really exciting reading experience, it's also a lovely viewing experience. So go ahead and definitely check out this book on fpri.org. So let me turn to you, Bob. I want to make sure we set the stage a little bit for this conflict. And that's actually really nicely laid out in the first chapter of the book. But let's start with the fact that this month marks the 5th anniversary of Russia's intervention in Syria. Tell us a little bit about what Moscow's political and geopolitical motives were in intervening.
Sure, thanks, Maia. And I think, and this is laid out in the first, second, third chapters, I think, but if you sort of knit the arguments and the observations in those chapters together, I think if you look at it from a perspective of in Syria, in the region, and globally, so what the Kremlin was after in Syria. In Syria, the immediate end, or the immediate objective, was to prevent the collapse of the Assad regime, which looked fairly likely in the summer of 2015. Assad regime was on its heels, looked like it was likely to fall probably within the next 6 to 12 months, and so the immediate objective was to prevent that outcome. Longer term within Syria, I think Moscow hoped to, and still does hope to, restore the sovereignty of the Syrian government. Whether that means the sovereignty of the Syrian government over every inch of territory of Syria inside its internationally recognized borders, as Assad often pledges to do, whether Moscow would support that or not remains to be seen, and whether the Russian armed forces have the capacity to do that or not remains to be seen. But at least inside of Syria, I think the immediate objective was to prevent the collapse of the government. Longer term, it was restore sovereignty of the Syrian government. Regionally, I think there were a couple of objectives that they pursued. One was to prevent the spread of what Moscow sees as Sunni extremism from Syria into what Russia has always considered its soft underbelly of the Caucasus and Central Asia. Mike Kofman makes the point in his chapter that decision makers in the Kremlin genuinely believe that if Assad fell, ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliates would take charge of a dismembered Syria, and that would allow that sort of ideology, that Sunni extremist ideology, to spread into areas in Russia's south that it's always been very concerned about. So that was one of the regional objectives. I think another was to take a stand against what the Kremlin calls the color revolutions, right? And both Mike and Anna talk about this in their chapters, this idea, and I talk about it in chapter 7 as well, but this idea in Russia that these people power revolutions, right? These popular revolutions in Georgia in the Rose Revolution, in Ukraine in both the Orange and Maidan revolutions, in Kyrgyzstan, and in the Arab Spring were not actually popular revolutions that overthrew authoritarian regimes, but were Western inspired, and in some cases the Kremlin claims Western backed, so backed by Western security services, that they were plots to overthrow governments that were friendly to Russia, right? So in the minds of at least some in the Kremlin, this has nothing to do with the spread of democracy and has everything to do with an attempt to subvert and overthrow regimes that are friendly to Moscow, with the ultimate goal being to foment a color revolution inside of Russia itself, right? And that seems sort of, a lot of us in the West, that seems like a preposterous fear, but a lot of people who study the Kremlin very closely will tell you it's a genuine fear. So I think regionally, those were the two primary objectives. And then globally, there was this, I think, desire to disrupt or subvert the US-led global order, which many in the Kremlin see not as the rules-based consultative order that its supporters claim it is, but as a scheme to essentially ensconce the US at the top of a hegemonic system and deny Russia its rightful place as a pole in a multipolar world. So if you look at it, inside of Syria, in the region, and then globally, I think that's how you can frame Russia's objectives in the intervention 5 years ago.
So, Bob, we had the good fortune of having you as the leader on this project, and as well as a co-editor. You're very uniquely positioned to talk about this war. You were actually the person tasked with setting up the deconfliction cell between the US and Russia, Russian forces in Syria. Tell us a little bit about that experience.
So yeah, like a lot of Eurasian Army foreign area officers, which I was for most of my career, many of us were pulled into this effort at one point or another to deal with the Russians over Syria, either in Geneva with the UN Syria Support Group, or in Kuwait with the deconfliction cell. So we had an air deconfliction cell since late 2015. Shortly after the Russians intervened in September, the US and Russia stood up a deconfliction cell to deconflict their operations in the air. In the summer of 2017, as US and Russian forces came closer and closer to each other on the ground, the US command, the three-star command in Kuwait that was responsible for the fight against ISIS in both Iraq and Syria, put out a call to stand up a ground deconfliction cell. And so we stood that up in late July, early August of 2017. I was sent over there to stand it up and sort of get it started. There were 4 military interpreters, fantastic, in many cases, native Russian speakers, that handled all the phone calls and the direct contact with the Russian headquarters at Hamami, Syria. And then throughout the summer and early
I think we have a little technical issue with Bob.
For a second.
Okay, you're back.
Sorry about that. So anyway, throughout the summer and fall of 2017, as US and Russian forces got closer and closer to each other on the ground, especially around the Euphrates River, in the central part of the Euphrates River Valley around Deir ez-Zor, the deconfliction cell got more and more active. And of course, it's maybe the peak of its activity was after I left in February of 2018, when there was the direct, I would say, military contact between Russian-backed forces, although not Russian military, and the US military, east of the Euphrates, south of Deir ez-Zor, near the Conoco oil fields, where some 200, mostly Wagner Group Russian mercenaries, were killed by US forces that were protecting themselves and their Syrian Democratic Force allies that had been attacked by that force.
That's fascinating. And I think it's really important for us to tell our audience what the situation is like at the moment before we go any deeper into the findings of this book. Syria presents a very complex picture today with multiple stakeholders involved there. It's kind of not that easy to follow if you're not an expert of the region, whether it's Iran's interests, Turkey's interests, Russia, obviously, the United States, our involvement sort of has changed quite a bit. And of course, we have Russia there. So there are possibilities for escalation, and you talk about those in the book. Which of those possibilities worry you most? What are the main possibilities that are likely, but which one worries you most?
I think, I think Idlib province, and I wrote, I think back in March, Idlib province is the most dangerous place on earth. And I still believe that's true. Now, this doesn't, I guess, luckily for the US, it doesn't directly involve the United States. But Idlib province is where Russia and the Assad regime, as they attacked and recaptured many of the cities that the opposition had captured early in the war, to avoid having to fight in an urban environment, which no military wants to do if it can avoid it. The Russians pursued this policy of sort of, I would call it surrender or starve, right? Where they would cut off humanitarian assistance to rebel-held cities. They would bomb them indiscriminately. And then at some point, when it became clear to the rebels that their options were to die in indiscriminate bombings and to take a lot of civilians down with them in indiscriminate bombings, or to starve to death, or to surrender, the Russians and the Assad regime would offer a humanitarian corridor out of the city and would let the fighters leave. And generally, they would send them or allow them to go to Idlib province. So in Idlib province now, you've got some ISIS elements, you've got some HTS elements, which is the former Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. So you've got two internationally designated terrorist groups. You've got a number of Turkish-backed groups. And then you've got the remnants of some of what we used to call the moderate opposition or the Western-backed opposition groups inside of Idlib province. So it's sort of a petri dish of anti-Assad opposition. The Turks have very strong interest in preventing an escalation in Idlib, both to protect the groups that they back that are in Idlib province, and also to prevent a refugee outflow, which is what started to happen in January and February this year when the Russians and the Assad regime started an offensive in Idlib. Iran has proxy groups in Idlib province. Of course, Russia and the regime have an interest in reconquering it because it's in northwest Syria, and it sits fairly close to the Russian air base at Hmeimim. And it's sort of a thorn in the side of the Assad regime's claim to have established sovereignty over most of Syria. So it's the last really truly opposition-held region of Syria. But it's the place where I think things could really go wrong very quickly. Again, they almost did. It took a Putin-Erdogan meeting in Moscow in March to stop the escalation after the Syrian regime killed over 30 Turkish troops who were at an outpost on the outskirts of Idlib province. The Turkish response really hobbled the fighting capability of the rebuilt Syrian army, right, that the Russians had spent almost 5 years rebuilding. In about 5 days, Turkey destroyed a lot of that combat power. So both sides, Russia and Turkey, had an interest in de-escalating. They were able to. The ceasefire to this point is held. But I think there's no obvious solution for Idlib province. And I think it's probably more likely than not over the next 6 months to a year that one of these proxy groups of one side or the other, Iran, Russia, Syria, Turkey, or just one of the terrorist groups, ISIS or HTS, escalates the situation in a way that gets out of the ability of all the sides to control and causes then a refugee outflow into Turkey. When it happened in the spring, what Turkey did was opened its borders to Greece and Bulgaria, right? And sort of backed off on the agreement it had with the EU to prevent the refugees from moving into the EU. So there are a whole lot of ways where Idlib could go wrong. And the consequences of that matter not only to Russia, the regime, and Turkey, but to Europe, because the likely outcome would be flows of refugees into the European Union.
What is the U.S. role at the moment? How much or how little is the U.S. involved in this conflict at this time?
Right. So the latest number I heard, I looked this up over the weekend, is about 600 troops on the ground remaining in Syria, down from about 2,000 a few years ago until President Trump started the withdrawal. In October 2019 is when he had announced a withdrawal earlier, but nothing actually happened on the ground. In October 2019, after a phone call with President Erdogan, is when he really started to pull the U.S. back off the Syrian-Turkish border in northern Syria. But we're still in northeastern Syria. We're still partnering with the Syrian Democratic Forces, the combined Kurdish and Sunni Arab coalition of about 65,000 fighters that really did most of the ground fighting to liberate northern and eastern Syria, basically all of Syria across the Euphrates from ISIS. So we're still there. We're still on the ground. We're also at a place called Al-Tan, which is in the tri-border Iraq, Jordan, Syria border region. And so, frankly, I don't think this is why I'm a little skeptical of, the folks for a couple of years have been proclaiming victory for Russia in Syria. They certainly have achieved their immediate objective of preventing the fall of the Assad regime, but they don't seem to have an answer for either Idlib province, which I talked about a minute ago, or Al-Tan or northeastern Syria. Although they are in northeastern Syria now, they crossed the river when the U.S. pulled off the border in late 2019 and early part of this year. The Russians and the Turkish armed forces filled the void. And so the incident we had with the Russians a few weeks ago, where a Russian vehicle bumped a U.S. vehicle and injured 4 U.S. soldiers, is a result of that decision to pull off the Turkish border and sort of leave a void in northern Syria that the Russians and the Turkish armed forces filled.
Let's turn to the book. I want to thank our audience for sending in the questions. We'll turn to those in a minute, so I want to encourage everyone to keep sending their questions. The goal of this book primarily was to increase our understanding of Russia as a geopolitical actor and allow Western governments to make more effective policy on issues where Russia is a factor. One of the main questions we asked was, what does Syria tell us about how Russia fights its wars? Obviously, that's an entire chapter in this book, which is your chapter, but maybe you could tell us a little bit about those conclusions.
Sure. So I talked about ends or objectives already in terms of Syria regionally and globally. If you look at, we look at the Army War College, at least, we teach strategy as a combination among ends, ways, and means informed by an assessment of risk. So the ends are objectives, ways are things you do, and means are resources or things you use. So one way to look at it is resources are things, they're nouns, means, and ways are actions or verbs. So if you look at the ways that Russia pursued its ends in Syria, one of them, and Mike Kofman lays this out very well in his chapter, is a geographically phased approach, where they fought only in certain regions at certain times. And that's a sort of normal campaign planning construct for any military, so that's not unusual. But how they supported the geographically phased approach is a little bit unusual, or at least bears, I think, learning from. One of the ways they did this was what I would call the instrumental use of de-escalation agreements in certain parts of the country to allow them to focus their fighting in other parts of the country. The military, we would call this an economy of force measure, right? So I don't want to fight in these 3 areas. I only want to fight here because it's the most important place for me to fight at this time. And so what they would do is they would conclude de-escalation agreements, especially after the passage of UN Security Council Resolution 2254, late 2015 and early 2016, the Russians and the regime would conclude these de-escalation agreements for certain parts of the country. The opposition groups in those parts of the country often saw these de-escalation agreements as a path to political reconciliation, political solution, reintegration, and the end of fighting. The Russians look at them in very instrumental terms. They were simply a way for them to not have to fight in one area so they could fight in another. As soon as the tactical situation allowed, the Russians and the regime broke the de-escalation agreement one after the other and attacked the opposition in those areas where there were de-escalation agreements in place. And so that allowed them to really focus their campaign geographically, and not have to fight where they didn't want to fight. Another thing they did is intentionally did not discriminate between UN designated terrorist organizations, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, HTS, and then other opposition groups, many of whom were signatories to the UN Security Council resolution and therefore were not legitimate targets under the UN Security Council resolution. Right? They were part of the cessation of hostilities. And early on in the intervention, the Russians actually targeted those groups and largely ignored ISIS and HTS, which, as Anna Borshchevskaya says in her chapter, that actually ended up helping ISIS, because a lot of those groups were the primary non-regime opposition to ISIS, right? They were the moderate or Western-backed groups that were fighting ISIS. And so the intentional non-discrimination between terrorist organizations and non-terrorist opposition groups, intentional lack of discrimination between military and civilian targets, especially in urban areas. And, you know, I think a lot of us would like to conclude that this bombing of schools and hospitals and things like that, bombing of civilian targets was accidental, but it's just too common, and it just appears very deliberate. And it actually had the effect that the Russians hoped it would, in that in these areas where the opposition was in charge, it induced terror in the civilian population and caused these IDP, these internally displaced person outflows, and caused a problem for the opposition group that was in charge. So I think that there was an intentional targeting of civilian infrastructure and civilian targets in order to induce terror and chaos inside of opposition-held cities. There was intentional escalation and de-escalation with the United States in order to often force a conversation that the Russians wanted to have on a specific issue, or force the revision of an existing de-escalation agreement. They would intentionally escalate the situation with us, confident that they could then de-escalate when they needed to, or force us into a conversation that they wanted to have. And so there was that intentional escalation with the US, an information campaign designed to portray their presence in Syria as legitimate. In other words, we were asked in by the legitimate government of Syria, and Western presence in Syria as illegitimate, with a sort of sub-bullet to that being that the US supports ISIS. And there's case after case after case of Russian disinformation operations that are designed to portray the US as supporting ISIS in Syria. And then finally, a parallel diplomatic channel in the Astana process that eventually, I think by late 2016, when this idea of a joint implementation group, a joint US-Russian targeting cell that was going to be located somewhere outside of Geneva, when all that fell apart, and it fell apart over the Russian and regime attack on eastern Aleppo, which at the time was the self-designated capital of the moderate opposition, when the UN, when it appeared, I think, to Russia that the UN was no longer a forum that would get Russia what it wanted in Syria, it started a parallel peace process called the Astana Process that brings in the Russians, the regime, the Syrian regime, Iran, Turkey. Sometimes some opposition groups are in attendance as well, but I think that's an attempt to end the war on terms more favorable to Russia than it thought it could get to the UN process. So those are the sort of the ways that the Russians have fought the war. And I think if we look at those, that may give us a template for how they would fight future wars. The idea of whether the Russian military fights according to some sort of doctrinal template or not is debatable. I think the conventional wisdom prior to this was that they didn't. That they first studied the environment in which they were going to fight, and that was more important to them than the type of war they were going to fight, whether it was a counterinsurgency or a great power conflict or whatever. Mike Kofman makes the point in his chapter, and I think it's really worth looking at, that the institutionalization of the lessons of Syria may result in some sort of doctrinal template for certain types of warfare, which would be a significant change in the way Russia fights its wars.
And another, major theme of this book is actually looking at the military aspects of it and assessing Russia's military capabilities, but not just as they are now, but how those capabilities evolved throughout the duration of this war so far. Our authors conclude that the Russian military has come a long way since it fought its 5-day war with Georgia in 2008. Tell us a little bit about that. What are some of the key improvements? And you were actually someone who covered the Russia-Georgia war very closely. You've written a very interesting report on the 10-year anniversary of that war, which is on our website. So I encourage our audience to check that out if they're interested in the conflict between Russia and Georgia. But what were some of the shortcomings that needed to be improved, and how has overall Russian military capability improved throughout this war in Syria?
So I think the key takeaway here is that all of the Russian services, the Army, the ground forces, the Aerospace Forces, and the Navy it was transformational for all of them, but much more transformational for the Air Force than the other two services. The Russian Air Force, I think, is an entirely different Air Force than it was 5 years ago. So for the ground forces, and Russia has always been, so I guess it's also worth saying at the start, Russia has always been predominantly a land power. And its land power has been it's the predominant form of power that it wields, and that's where its strength predominantly lies. But the ground forces were much less impacted than the air forces were in Syria. In terms of the ground forces, it's even more interesting that I guess the hammer of Russian ground forces, its armored and mechanized forces, were almost completely uninvolved in Syria. What were involved were what we would call the enablers, right? So air defense, artillery, military police, and things like that, engineers in terms of route clearing and mining and things like that. And then the staffs, especially Russian ground forces staffs at the battalion level and above, were very much involved. And so for the Army, it got much better at military police tasks, at engineering tasks. Again, bridging rivers, right? The operation to bridge the Euphrates south of Deir ez-Zor was the Russian Army did that. The Syrian Army was incapable of doing it, and so the Russian Army did it for them. Air defense, although there was not much of an air threat, but they did end up bringing in a lot more air defense assets to protect their air base at Hmeimim and the Navy base at Tartus. And then, like I said, the military staffs who really rebuilt the Syrian army. When the Russians got to Syria in 2015, they were surprised to find out that the Syrian army had essentially disintegrated. So they had to rely on local proxy forces and militia forces while they rebuilt the Syrian army. So they got very good at that. So I think you're going to see much better staffs at the battalion level and all the way up, and you're going to see very much improved artillery, much improved air defense capabilities, although much of the air defense lies outside of the army. Better rotary wings, so better helicopter, better military police, better engineers. But the armored and mechanized forces were not really engaged. And so the sort of center of gravity of the Russian army was not engaged. In terms of the Air Force, I think the Air Force really got better in every conceivable way. They started the war and they remain limited in the amount of precision-guided munitions that they can employ, but through the use of the Gefest site, they're able now to drop dumb bombs with almost smart bomb accuracy. They strategic bombing runs out of Russia over Iran and Iraq into Syria and back. Support the ground forces, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, all these things that air forces do, except for air-to-air combat. But even in that sense, they got better at it because they were flying in the same airspace as the US was. So although they weren't fighting the US Air Force, they were certainly watching the US Air Force, the US Navy over the skies of Syria, and they got much better at understanding how we operate in our capabilities. In terms of the Navy, I think, and Igor Delanoe's chapter, I think, lays this out really well, but I think the use of Kaliber cruise missiles from the Caspian Sea, from the Eastern Mediterranean, the logistics effort that the Navy mounted when it was able and has been able to sustain to this point, and then some air defense assets that they were able to position in the Eastern Mediterranean were the Navy's primary contribution.
Thank you, Bob. I want to tell our audience that over the next few weeks, we will actually bring in some of our chapter authors and talk about these sort of specific areas more in depth. So keep an eye on our website for those event announcements. But in the meantime, I want to turn to our audience questions. I have one from Amit Bandia. It asks, what in the future can be expected of the Syrian Democratic Forces, and what can we anticipate by way of US support?
I'll take a crack at that one. It's a great question. The SDF again, is a coalition of Sunni Arab and Kurdish militias that was supported by the U.S. and so sort of formed over time. The core of it and the leadership of it is primarily Kurdish. And so when you'll hear folks in Turkey and folks in Russia say the U.S. is supporting the Kurds or fighting with the Kurds, it comes from the fact that the core of the SDF, the original militias, were largely Kurdish militias from northern Syria that the U.S. supported in the liberation of Raqqa, which at the time was the ISIS capital in Syria. And then over time, the coalition expanded to include Sunni Arab militias from the East Bank of the Euphrates, with sort of a tacit deal between the Kurdish leadership and the Sunni Arab tribes on the East Bank of the Euphrates that if those tribes sent their militias to help liberate Raqqa, then the SDF, once it had liberated Raqqa, would fight its way down the East Bank of the Euphrates and liberate their region, their villages. And so that deal worked out, and the SDF has cohered to this point. The U.S. continues to say that it is interested in partnering with the SDF. The SDF is the only force really in most of eastern Syria that is able to prevent the re-emergence of ISIS there. Of course, U.S. credibility took a huge hit when we withdrew from the border in late 2019, early 2020, and allowed the Turkish armed forces to come across and fight the SDF. So I think maybe the presidential election will determine what the U.S., the future of the U.S. relationship with the SDF. I don't think it'll be a radical difference between the two administrations, but I think a Biden administration would probably be more interested in a long-term partnership with the SDF to ensure that that portion of Syria that the SDF liberated from ISIS, that there's some sort of political arrangement that gives the SDF's political arm, because they also have a political arm, a bit of autonomy or some sort of inside of the borders of Syria as it's currently constituted. So nobody's talking about changing borders. But I think there may be some interest in an arrangement that preserves some of the local autonomy that the SDF and the Sunni Arab tribes and the Kurds in northern and eastern Syria currently enjoy.
I'm going to sort of combine a bunch of questions that we have here, because one of them asks whether or not, this Syria fits into the debate about Russian hybrid warfare, especially in Ukraine. Another asks about what lessons Russia has learned about the use of mercenary forces. And I want to connect that a little bit to Russia's use of private military companies, which is really relevant in the case of Syria. I don't know if you would necessarily call this does not really fit into a hybrid warfare in any way, but we do have this sort of shady use of the PMCs. So maybe you could talk about that part.
Sure. So, and Anna Borshchevskaya, one of our chapter authors, as you know, Maia, because you interviewed her about it, she's written a paper for FPRI on Russia's use of PMCs. And so, and Charles Bartles and Les Grau, who authored the chapter in this volume on ground forces, have a whole section on the use of PMCs. And so for people who are really interested in that, I would refer you to that chapter and also to Anna's paper and the interview you did with her. But the primary PMC that the Russians have used, obviously, in Syria is the Wagner Group. The extent to which the Kremlin controls the day-to-day activities of the Wagner Group on the ground is unclear to me. I think the February 2018 incident in which the Wagner Group and Syrian allies attacked the US and SDF base in eastern Syria, that's the best known incidents of Wagner Group activity in Syria. It ended very badly for the Wagner Group. A couple hundred of them were killed in the US counterattack. That appears to be, to me, more a case of just freelancing on the part of the Wagner Group than an attempt by the Russian command in Syria to test US resolve. Because there was, when we became aware that they were moving, and they were moving toward US forces and that they were firing on partner forces and US forces, our ground deconfliction cell put a call into the Russian headquarters at Hmeimim, and the Russian headquarters said, We have no knowledge. We have, they essentially disavowed what was going on the ground. And so if it was an attempt to test U.S. resolve, that would have been the time, I think, for the Russian headquarters to say, okay, the Americans are serious now. They're calling us to say they're about to attack this group, and we have a chance to stop it. So it's likely that they didn't know what was happening. But so the Wagner Group certainly provides a veneer of deniability to the Kremlin. It pursues objectives that are probably coterminal or in line with the Kremlin's objectives, but it also, I think, freelances a little bit. There's one theory that what they were after in that attack in February 2018 was an oil field and oil facilities that they would then be able to make money off of. So it's really hard to say, but the Wagner Group is very active in Syria. And again, if you look at the ground forces chapter of this book and Anna's work she's done, there's more information there.
Thank you, Bob. I have actually a very good question here. Can you quickly touch on how the war is perceived by the Russian public, and how or if the Russians have learned to keep public support for a long-term effort, especially with such human rights violations? Or does the Russian public not know, similar to Afghanistan? It's a loaded question there.
It is. I don't know, I don't know if Chris wants to weigh in on that too, because he has a good sense, I think, of Russian public opinion. My sense is that the Kremlin has been fairly successful in keeping the bad news in terms of casualties from the Russian public, except when there are major sort of mass casualty events like the bombing of the Metrojet, I think it was a Metrojet flight in late 2015 by ISIS, the accidental downing of the Russian military aircraft by the Syrians in the context of an Israeli attack on Iran, which that incident alone will tell you is a great vignette for how complicated this war is, right? So, but aside from those cases, or the cases where there's a high-level Russian officer who's killed, in which case they usually try to blame the U.S. Indirectly by saying we enabled ISIS to do it, they've been fairly good at keeping any sort of bad news about Syria out of the headlines and portraying it as a successful case of Russia standing up to the U.S., defending its interests, preventing terrorism from reaching the Russian Federation, and supporting a quote-unquote legitimate government, that's beset by a terrorist movement inside its borders. But I'd be interested to hear what Chris thinks too about that.
Yeah, Chris, what do the Russian people think of the war?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's a hard question to get at for some of the reasons that Bob mentioned. It's not reported on necessarily in the most objective fashion, and public opinion polling is complicated in any country, but I think especially in Russia. But I think the key point from my perspective is that although some people like to draw comparisons between Russia and Syria and the Soviet Union and Afghanistan, and in fact, they're just two totally different operations. That Russian military forces are not sustaining large scale casualties of the type that the Soviets were in Afghanistan, and so there's actually a lot less to cover up or to explain to the populace. And the fact that a lot of the casualties are happening among mercenaries or the Wagner Group, not official military forces, again makes it easier to explain away or to not explain at all. So I think the picture of the war that the Russian populace gets is not a picture of what looks like a real war. It's sort of a military operation that does come with some costs in terms of lives, but it's not as though I think the average Russian thinks that Russia is at war in Syria. There's a military operation underway, but that's very different than I think being at war is conceptualized.
Thank you, Chris. I have a couple of questions that are somewhat related. I don't know if Aaron wants to answer this because this is kind of his area. I had a question about whether or not Russia has used the weapons of mass destruction in Syria. Another question asks, what are any lessons learned for the Russian military with regard to chemical weapons usage? And Aaron, maybe you could talk a little bit about, chemical weapons usage in this war. I know there's not much there, but if there's been a mention of this, especially early on, anything you want to add to that?
Sure. My overarching takeaway about the Russian role in the Syrian regime's use of chemical weapons is that we are actually seeing a degradation of Russian support for non-proliferation principles. I would say particularly after the Cold War and even during the Cold War, one of the linchpins or pillars of the American-Russian bilateral relationship was the shared understanding that the spread of weapons of mass destruction was a bad thing. And you did see some overlap and some interests in both arms control, which entirely different event, but is in itself collapsing for mutually agreed upon reasons. But in Syria in and of itself is that you see Russian shielding of the Assad regime at the UN Security Council for further punishment on the use of weapons of mass destruction, in this case chemical weapons, and you also see them using chemical weapons as tools of assassination in their own campaigns against dissidents and rival political figures. I would say for the regime in itself, chemical weapons have proved quite beneficial. You know, there's this sort of mantra that chemical weapons aren't very effective, or at least aren't the best ways to fight a war because of all sorts of ideas. I think that actually isn't true, and I have a paper on this I can share if anybody's interested, about how chemical weapons were effective for the regime for clearance of urban areas, to do exactly what Bob was talking about, which was to stay out as they participated in these, you know, starve or surrender campaigns. If they didn't surrender, the regime would rather avoid fighting in urban areas. And of those last remnants who held out, you could poison them. And, you know, the psychological impact of WMD, there's lots of studies on this from both Iranian and Kurdish survivors of WMD attacks, is such that, you know, your higher rates of PTSD, all sorts of things, that they become an effective weapon to both force surrender and also to kill people if they don't surrender. And I think that answers the question, so I'll hand it over to somebody else.
Thank you, Aaron. Does anyone want to comment on this, or should we get to the next question? Okay. So Bob, I have a question about the deconfliction efforts. What have been the successes or failures of the military deconfliction hotlines in Syria? And are there lessons that can be applied to other regions with close proximity of Russia and US NATO forces? For example, Black Sea, the Baltic Sea. I don't think there is any need for sort of a deconfliction cell in the conflicts around the Black Sea or the Baltic Sea, but maybe you can talk about, you know, how you've seen the deconfliction efforts since.
Sure, I'd say, I guess the primary success of both the air and ground deconfliction efforts was that they prevented an accidental escalation, an accidental direct military conflict between the US and the Russian Federation, which is it's a major geopolitical objective to prevent that, right? So that, I think, that alone means that they were worth whatever effort it took on the part of both sides. The failure, and this isn't a failure as much as it is just a realization that the US and Russia are using these channels for different reasons. Russia uses them very instrumentally, the way it uses a lot of institutions and organizations, you know, laws, norms, everything else, to pursue its own objectives. For the US, the primary objective was to prevent an escalation, unintended escalation between the US and Russia, prevent us from accidentally shooting at each other. I think for the Russians, that was certainly an important goal. Another goal, though, was to use them to force decisions or force conversations on issues where the Russians wanted to, you know, a change in a deconfliction agreement, for instance. They would use the deconfliction lines or they would use them to announce that they were about to strike in an area where they claimed to see ISIS, where they knew, we knew and we thought that they knew that it was not ISIS, it was the SDF, it was the US partner force, right? The strike was intended to try to deter the US and its partner force from moving out of northern Syria. This is in the fall of 2017, spring of 2018, and moving down the east bank of the Euphrates, fighting ISIS, clearing ISIS there, because in the minds of, I think, the Assad regime and Russia, they wanted to liberate that part of Syria from ISIS. But the SDF were the locals there. They were the local forces, the local militias, and frankly, the regime and the Russians didn't have the military capacity at that time, and probably still don't, to liberate and control that entire portion of Syria. I mean, the SDF is 65,000 fighters, so it's a significant force. So I'd say the primary success of the deconfliction lines was they prevented exactly what they were intended to prevent: us and the Russians from shooting at each other. To the extent that they're a failure or shortcoming, we've used them for different reasons. But that's just sort of the nature of the two governments, I think.
Well, I want to ask you one last quick question. In this book, we talk about how the war has been rather expensive and for Russia and has lasted quite a long time. But how does the war end for Russia from Russia's interests? What would be the best outcome from Moscow's perspective?
I think the best outcome is at low cost. The Assad regime is able to reestablish its sovereignty over all of Syria inside of its internationally recognized borders. That means Idlib, Al-Tanf, and northeastern Syria, the three areas where the Assad regime does not control. The question is, how do you do that? I don't think they have an answer for Idlib, and reestablishing control over the Al-Tanf region and northeastern Syria requires the U.S. to leave there. And I don't think they have an answer for how to do that. So that's the best case outcome, is a low cost way to achieve government control over all of Syria. I don't think Russia needs that, though, for the war to be a success. The Assad regime does, but I don't think Russia does. I think the Russians know this is a limited war, and limited wars often end inconclusively, right? I mean, the U.S. Desert Shield, Desert Storm is maybe the textbook example of a limited war for limited objectives that ended inconclusively. This war may end the same way. It may end with some sort of negotiated settlement, but it may not end. I mean, it may not end in at least the foreseeable future, because it could get worse before it gets better, right? So. But I think as long as Russia preserves its access in the Eastern Mediterranean, its partnership with the Assad regime, its naval base at Tartus, its air base at Memim, then it can say that it achieved what it set out to achieve for the war, which was save the Assad regime from collapse, take a stand against color revolutions, prevent the spread of extremism into Russia's soft underbelly of the Caucasus and Central Asia, and force the U.S. to reckon with Russia in the Middle East and geopolitically as a major player. And it doesn't need a whole Syria reestablished inside of its international borders to have that. So I think the Russian government may be happy with, or may be content with, an inconclusive outcome, as long as it preserves those bottom lines.
Thank you, Bob. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. I want to thank you, Bob, for joining us. Aaron, Chris, thank you and congratulations on this really exciting book. I want to encourage our audience members to check it out on our website and in the link that's in the chat box. And keep an eye out for more publications and events around this project. We will be talking quite a bit about Russia and Syria over the next couple of months. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.